Whew, my pace is significantly reduced, but, there's only so much you can do when you got 50 plus series to get through. It's an exaggeration, but we might get close to that. Hi, my name is Sebastian. This is Vision Denial, and the road to MSI, where I watch every playoff series before MSI. Even that one. We got a nice special treat of T1 versus DRX. We've got over here a wonderful DRX who are outperforming, supposedly, in T1. And T1, who still with Faker is never to be counted out. Just never. Now, I could go on with the usual spiel about how I thought the vision in this game, or in this series, was great, superb. In fact, T1 has the best vision denial, where they literally were able to play around information superbly. Like, it is great. If there's anybody who should study, like, macro League of Legends, like, study T1. Like, down to a T with it. And I could talk about the execution of compositions, which is fairly consistent on both sides. I could also talk about how good the team fighting is. It's pretty solid. And I guess I will go through all of those things, but there is one thing I do want to discuss. And I usually, with all these videos, I talk about how there's like a lack, until we started watching the Korean playoff series, and it's likely going to happen as the next one after this is a Chinese one and then a Pacific one. And like the one, for a while, a lot of these playoff series will be featured heavily from the East side of League of Legends world, is that there's a lot of creativity with these particular picks and bans where there's rarely a repeat. Now, this series is no exception to this, minus the fact that DRX tends to decide to opt into a repeating one composition once, but that I guess is like their response to two different compositions T1 brought out. No. I don't want to just talk about like the variety, because the variety is like important to me when coming into an international tournament, because that indicates to me the level of flexibility and a level of adaptability that'll come with facing a different region. Because it's one thing to be able to do pick and bans well. It's another that you are able to adapt to a situation where you're playing against a region with a completely different style, or a mostly different style, for a lot of these cases. And if you don't have that variety going into a playoff, then that means that when you head to the international stage, it shows a lack of that ability. And the first thing that comes to mind is the LGD issue, where they were having a hard time and they're struggling against a lot of the lower seeded teams, a lot of the lower region teams in the Worlds last year. Now, I do this preamble primarily because there's no issue about, like, even from DRX, like from T1 to DRX, neither of these teams showed me like needing to go back to something that they had already done. Even if DRX had repeated it for one game, they still had three solidly different compositions and showed that they were able to apply them all. That being said, and I'm going to also say that T1 won this 3-1. So this wasn't like a completely one-sided matchup, but it definitely feels that way for a lot of these games. T1 has some very bizarre choices in terms of their pick and ban. Like, a thing I have yet to discuss, and this is probably episode 17 of these. And I haven't discussed these because, or I have in passing, where I talk about like the simplicity of some compositions, and I'm happy that some of the lower seeded teams do that they pick simple compositions. But I don't talk about like if their compositions mesh well during the pick and bans, or if the ban strategy is like makes sense, or if they're able to do some interesting pivots here and there, or if like there's a cohesiveness to their composition, or how easy it is to execute versus the opposing composition and how much is dependent on like very specific phases, right? Like that's not something that I've discussed a lot, and it's because it hasn't been super relevant because a lot of these teams from other regions are picking and doing pick and bans around the same level of execution, right? They all do the same kind of either really good habits or really bad habits across the board. That is not the case here. And I mention this because DRX was solidly picking way better and doing a ban strategy way better than T1. And the cat, I highly recommend watching this series. It's a lot of fun to watch. It's not as hype as the Hama Life versus Nangshan Red Force, but this is a lot of fun to watch. But the casters talk about how like T1 have picked themselves into holes sometimes where it's very difficult to execute a lot of these compositions, and not just because they're complicated compositions, but because the type of compositions they pick against DRX is already difficult in a lot of senses and requires very narrow options to win and to apply their win conditions on top of them being very complicated to apply. Sometimes not, but a lot of the cases they are. And it really strikes me as weird that T1 wins in a lot of these. And I think it's just weird. It speaks to the amount of understanding T1 had, and I wrote this a lot of times in my notebook here. It speaks to the understanding that T1 knows when DRX's win conditions and power spikes apply, how to neutralize it, and how to neutralize it in a way that allows them to bring their win conditions to a solid state. But they're going to run into a wall. And this is a region that I've kept up enough to know that they're going to run into a wall facing Damwon. Now, we haven't seen Damwon, but they were the world champions for the 2020 World Championships. They were absolutely dominant. No one could stop them. They lost, I think, a total of 2 or 3 games across the board in the entire tournament. So it was like pretty scary. But they're gonna, but for the scope of this, they're gonna eventually run against Damwon, or even with Genji, who both of those teams have been more consistent in terms of their pick and ban decisions, and have a better record of performance. It doesn't matter that you're squeezing out these crazy wins and that you're like your macro, like your global decisions, your wave manipulations are very strong because they are. It's really good. Um, is that at some point you're going to pick yourselves into a hole with such a narrow win condition that the enemy team's going to recognize. Now, I don't have a solid prediction for how T1 is going to face off against Genji. If anything, I'd probably guess it would eke out 3-0 for one side over the other just due to momentum. And that's how a lot of these higher seeded, like the more you go into a playoff, rarely does it get to 5 games. And if it does, it just speaks to like how close a region is or how much a region needs to work on itself. So what then? Right? Like, what about it? Why is this the thing that I'm using the vast majority of this video for? Well, because T1 did have a game where they picked a very smart composition. And that was game 3. Where they picked a very strong 1-3-1 composition with some strong siege and skirmish and dive options. That was like very, like you can clearly understand how the win condition applies and know when it was going to go, and know that it did not have like a very narrow like window compared to their opponent. It was still complicated, but like I rather a composition that doesn't have a narrow win condition and just a complicated one. And so I like moving forward, and it's unfortunate. DRX, wow, I thought I fixed this habit. DRX, so DRX here did really well on a lot of phases, right? Their vision denial wasn't as strong, and I think that had a lot to do with the way that they were unable to access their neutral objectives to get setups done, and they weren't able to properly apply wave manipulations. They were not as strong of a team. They were, out of the four of the Korean teams, DRX shows to be the weakest one. And that's really saying something because DRX is still much stronger than all of the other teams we've seen that were not Korean. And like this statement's slowly going to change as we move to the other regions that are finally starting. But it was disheartening to see a team that had so solidly comprehended their approach to pick and ban and were very prepared to be creative and adaptive to each pick and ban from game to game and understood their win conditions, only to be edged out by a team who had a massive skill difference between them that just wasn't doing pick and ban properly. Now, if DRX had won this series, I would have solidly said that they were not going to survive the series after this. So I guess it's good because I don't think they would have been able to edge out and make it to MSI. The two teams after this, like even against Homolife, I don't think that they would have done as well. That being said, the I would give Homolife a solid B to B plus. Good. I haven't given a grade a lot of these recently because sometimes they're like reductive. They don't necessarily give like a point to where I'm going with this, but it stands to reason that this is a very solid team, and I hope that they clean up their laning phase and that they clean up some of their wave manipulation and macro decision making, because I hope that they do much better next during the summer split, so that they, when they attempt to qualify for Worlds, they end up being one of the 3 to 4 teams. We'll see how MSI turns out to make it to Worlds. I think they make a very good splash at it. T1, you have a near perfect approach to the macro game. Near perfect. You guys do some weird decision making here and there that gets you caught out. But when that happens, you're already so solidly ahead. I think it has more to do with like hubris than anything else. And you guys have a weird approach to like your laning phase. It looks on paper like you guys would smash from like roll to roll to roll to roll, but it doesn't always pan out that way. So I think you're gonna have to clean up your laning phase in your early game because they're not the most consistent, and clean up the way that you do your macro, but just like just a smidgens, if you're going to be able to beat Genji. And I think that's not a hard thing to practice out in a couple of days. I'm pretty sure this game happened yesterday. Yeah, and you guys have like a couple of days before another one happens. I think so. A week maybe, because I don't see you in my upcoming schedule. I can only schedule so many things here. Now, the biggest thing you guys need to do, because you have I think this was the best Vision game I've seen, even Vision Denial, best. You guys played with information incredibly well. You got a whole bunch of stuff going for you. Just coaching staff, team, because it's a collaborative effort. Like the coaching staff is not exclusively like in charge of doing pick and ban. There's also, the players have input because they have to be comfortable to play the champions that they want, or that they have like given as options. You guys need to be more prepared and more cohesive, because I think it looks either that like you don't prepare at all, and I doubt that. You're a top 4 team in Korea. So either you don't prepare or you do prepare, but you prepare in such a way that's questionable more than anything else. So I would highly suggest, and like they're not gonna listen to me. I'm rando, but like I would like to see T1 come up with compositions that are more cohesive, just overall, and are much less difficult to approach. The simpler the composition, the easier it is to apply the rest of it, which is immaculate. So, like, just a little bit to fix. It's not as much as the other teams when I tell them, hey, fix this before you make it to the international tournament. And it's like a lot of the work that a bunch of Korean teams have done already. Yeah. For all of you that watch, let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoy this video, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one where I go through... It's the first of the 12 Chinese series. China, why do you have so many series? I'll see you in the next one. Bye.